This is episode 99 of the Going Beyond the Food Show, and today we're talking to Dr. Carolyn Ross about the 5-step to healing binging and overeating. My name is Stephanie Dozie. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and at 35, I was strapped with severe anxiety, panic attack, obesity, and my health completely collapsed. I needed solution, and my journey began. Each episode of the Beyond the Food Show, we bring you an expert or a message to help you achieve your health goal, unlock your self-confidence, and live a better life. This episode of the Going Beyond the Food Show is brought to you by the Going Beyond the Food Project, my baby. The Going Beyond the Food Project is an online health conference that is focused on teaching you how to ditch the diet mindset, transform your relationship to food, and feel good for good. I have handpicked 21 health experts that think and live outside the diet and weight loss dogma box and will help you transform your life with a radical new way of looking at health and weight loss and help you change your relationship to food. And one of those guests is today's guest on the podcast as well, Dr. Carolyn Ross. If you are interested in registering for the Going Beyond the Food Project, there is a free viewing from November 1st to the 8th, 2017. You can go to the website goingbeyondthefood.com/register. You can register there or go to the show note of today's episode, stephaniedozie.com/099. Now, as I said, Dr. Carolyn Ross, which is our expert today that's going to take us through the 5 steps of healing binging and overeating, is one of the speakers on the conference. And there's a real good reason for that. I love this woman. I love her work. I love her as a person. I love her approach. Everything about her is in complete alignment with me and my work. And as you know me, I think differently. I approach healing differently. I approach health differently. I approach food differently. So what you're going to hear today with relationship to binging, overeating, even compulsive eating is not what you've been told. It is completely different because we're approaching it from a root cause perspective. We're not talking about food. We're not talking about restricting more. We're talking about finding the layer in yourself that you need to address to heal that behavior. Now, Dr. Carolyn Ross is an author, a speaker, an expert in the world of integrative medicine for eating disorder, obesity, and addiction. She treats well beyond food addiction. She will go into alcohol and drugs as well because it's all the same thing. So I can't wait for you to listen to this episode here, and also in hope that you will join us on the Going Beyond the Food Project. And on the project, we're going to talk about food addiction with Dr. Ross. But today is what you've requested, which is binging and overeating. And it's a segue to our last episode, episode 98, where I talked about the 21 reasons why diet don't work and why they lead you to binging and overeating, just like they did for me. So if you haven't listened to this episode, it's kind of a precursor to the show today. So I would highly recommend you go back to 98. It's a short one. Today is a longer one because it's a topic that needs to be addressed, and it's not singular. It is not simple. So it's a 1-hour show, but even if you have it to listen again to 2-shot, it's worth it. So we're going to talk about today the 5-step to healing binging, overeating, and compulsive eating. And before we go into this, I want to make sure that all the listener understand this is not about disordered eating at a diagnostic level. This is about behavior that common people like you and I and your neighbor are having, and what we need to do to heal that. And it's likely not what you think. So, are you ready to do this? Let's do this. Hey, Dr. Ross, how are you?
Hey, Stephanie, how are you? We've got to stop meeting like this.
We have to do it face to face.
One day, I hope, maybe in August.
Yes. Yeah, because we were talking about an event we may attend together. But we're in the midst of the Going to Beyond the Food project here. And when I queued the people that were signing up for the conference, the number one pain point was overeating and binge behaviors.
Yes.
And I use the word behaviors because the people that are coming or listening to this podcast right now, in most cases, are not diagnosed binge eater in the world of medical references.
That's very interesting because actually there are so many people who actually do qualify for that diagnosis of binge eating disorder who have not been diagnosed yet. So I think it's a very, very small percentage, somewhere around 3%, that may have been diagnosed. But there's many, many more who could fit the criteria for sure.
That's who's listening right now. And people know that they're overeating. They know that they're eating not out of hunger,
Yeah.
but they don't quite know, what to do about it, which we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the 5 steps to healing binge eating behavior or disorder. But let's begin by the beginning and talk about what is binging, what is overeating, how do the two compare, and where do we put ourselves? Like, where are we in
On the
assessing?
spectrum.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Well, I think let's just start with the definition of a binge. So a binge is defined as eating a large quantity of food in a short period of time, usually less than a 2-hour period of time. So a lot of your listeners may be thinking, well, we all of us joke about I binge watch TV or I binged on chocolate or whatever. But a binge is really, it is now a medical term. So it's a large quantity of food in a short period of time. And often there's confusion between someone who's diagnosed with actual binge eating disorder versus someone who may be called a compulsive overeater. And when we think about overeating, that can take a number of forms. It can be something as little as what we used to call grazing, eating snacks all through the day. And that ends up being overeating at the end of the day. Or it may be eating more than you should at your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just eating a larger quantity than your body needs at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that's a completely different category from someone who sits down with a really large quantity of food and goes through that in less than a 2-hour period. Now, just to segue to the type of person who may be overeating or the type of person who may be has binge eating disorder. A person with binge eating disorder tends to have an enormous amount of distress, guilt, shame, embarrassment about how much they're eating. They tend to eat more in isolation. So it's not somebody who's just, sitting down at a restaurant with family and everybody's overeating. It's someone who tends to more binge in secret because they're so embarrassed about how much they're eating. There is a high genetic association with people who have binge eating disorder, and it tends to run in families. So that's somebody who has these different qualities that are closer to someone with another eating disorder like anorexia or bulimia, in that they have that emotional distress and they also have more psychological components to their disorder. So they may have a higher incidence of bipolar, or higher incidence of depression or anxiety or other mental health issues. And then the person who's overeating, who may have a weight problem or not, generally doesn't have the same degree of emotional distress associated with their overeating. So that's a little bit of a snapshot. I'm trying to think if I've left anything out there.
I'm not sure, but I'm going to give you a situation. So somebody that on a Wednesday night, tired, sit in front of the TV and goes through a bag of chip.
Yeah.
Is that a binge eating?
Yeah. So this is a great question, Stephanie, because this is where the rubber meets the road, because there isn't an amount that's specified. It's just described as a large amount of food. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily consider that a binge, but it's not just about how much food they eat. So you have to put it in the bigger context, okay? So if that person sits and they eat a large bag of chips, and they also have some of the psychological issues we talked about, the genetic component. Maybe they, like 90 to 98% of people with binge eating disorder actually have trauma in their background too. So that could be, another component. So it's really, you have to look at the bigger picture, not just how much food.
So it's like going beyond the food, right? It's not just
It
about the
is.
food.
It's going beyond the food. You're a genius. So,
And I know you're a medical doctor, right? So your role is to diagnose people. But at the same time, I want to help everyone that's listening today and say that the message today is it only for people that are diagnosed as binge eater, or it's also for the person sitting in front of the TV on a Wednesday night and eating a bag of chip that doesn't have all the trauma around them?
yeah. Well, like I said, not everybody with binge eating disorder has trauma. Another point, not everybody with binge eating disorder is obese or overweight. The majority are, but there's about 18% who are normal weight. I even had a woman who walked into my office and she truly had binge eating disorder, but looking at her, you would think she was anorexic. So, again, not about the food, not about the weight. It's really about this whole diagnostic criteria. So we've gone through a part of it, but the other part is that the binges have to occur greater than or equal to one time a week for 3 months. So if somebody just eats a bag of chips once and then a whole month goes by and they don't do that again until next month, that would not qualify them for the diagnosis of binge eating disorder. And I think that's important to know because almost all of us could say we've binged at least once or twice in our lives, or every Thanksgiving in America, every Christmas, every barbecue, 4th of July, etc. Many of us eat large quantities of food, but that happens once a year or it happens, every few months. So this is a chronic problem. And it tends to take over your life in the same way that anorexia and bulimia take over your life. It tends to affect your ability to function in the world. You may be avoiding social occasions or work dinners because of your binge eating disorder. It can affect your relationships because, again, there's so much embarrassment and emotional distress around the behavior. That's why I gave the example of people who say, oh, I binged on this or I binged on that. It's part of the lexicon in our language now. But for people who actually have binge eating disorder, it's very, very serious and can really interrupt your life.
So if I'm the person, like you said, who will go through a bag of chip here and there, but doesn't have all that trauma around it, doesn't do it frequently, but I still overeat, then I classify myself into the world of overeater, there is still a reason why I'm doing that. And there is still ways for me to help that behavior, correct?
Absolutely. And I don't want to make it sound like it's less of a problem because people who are compulsive overeaters also experience issues related to their eating, often related to their weight. But I just wanted to give you kind of a spectrum. And on the spectrum, binge eating disorder has a whole bunch of other stuff associated with it.
Compulsive overeater, you said?
Yeah, or just overeater. There's so many terms now that we haven't come up with the right term. And honestly, I think overeaters should be part of the eating disorder spectrum, but they're not. They're not considered that for whatever reason, usually political in my experience. But someone who's an overeater also is unhappy about their eating behaviors.
So, what's causing this? What is the reason why me and many of the listener call them binge eating, diagnosed people, compulsive eater, overeater? Why do we reach to food?
hmm I think that's the important question. And in my experience, and I've been working with people who are overeaters and binge eaters for, I don't know, 30 plus years, In my experience, there's several reasons that are important. We know that there's a genetic component to overeating. And you can look at families, and often you'll see all of them are overeaters. And so they say that obesity is about 50 to 70% hereditable. So there's a strong genetic component, which means that it doesn't mean that you have to be an overeater, but it means that just like my dad died of a heart attack when he was really young, that puts me at higher risk for heart attack. Maybe I won't have one, hopefully not. But I am at higher risk, and I think the same goes for people who are overeaters. We also, can look at emotional components. So even with overeaters, there can be trauma. But even when you don't talk about the big T trauma, often there's bullying in their background. There may have been other, what may be called small T traumas, parents divorce, and that changes a child's life. I mean, the death of a parent. And now we have a whole category for those particular events, which are called adverse childhood events. I'm not sure if you have talked a bit about this on your program before, but the adverse childhood events study, I think, is one of the most brilliant studies we've ever had. And it was started right here in San Diego with Vince Valetti at Kaiser. Now the Centers for Disease Control is running this study. There's over 17,000 people in it. And to make a long story short, what it shows is that if you had certain adverse childhood experiences, you are more likely to be an overeater, more likely to be obese, more likely, more at risk for substance use, depression, and a whole host of medical problems. So you have to look at the emotional component and where that comes from. So when you think about it from that way, Stephanie, just think about throwing a diet at somebody. You're saying to somebody, okay, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, when in fact, their problem lies deeper. And it's more about how do I heal the suffering that I had as a child? And then you say, oh, well, to heal that, just don't eat, just restrict. When you think about it like that, it's ludicrous to even think that a diet could help in that situation. And it almost never does because it is a deeper issue.
We've talked about that with many of the speakers on the project, which is starting next Wednesday for people listening right now. If you have not registered yet, you can go in the show note and register. But we've had many of the doctor and many of the therapists talk about that because it goes beyond the eating behaviors. It's about autoimmunity. It's about gut health. It's about like somatic work. Like there's a variety.
And it's about stress too.
Oh, yeah.
Interestingly, I just read a statistic that people with binge eating disorder, for example, often that is triggered by a stressful event in their lives, and they tend to have a higher level of stress. And the same can be said for people who are overeaters. I just attended a conference where one of the speakers talked about how stress affects the body by the production of cortisol. Yeah. And when you produce cortisol, that's kind of an automatic lead in to weight gain, comfort food eating, etc. But what was interesting to me is they had also done a study that showed that dieting was stressful and caused increased release of cortisol by the body. So yet another of the 21 reasons why diets don't work. But stress has been associated in multiple studies with having a higher BMI. And that's one of the things that in my approach that I work a lot with people on is stress management.
And you're right, because for me, for people who don't know yet my story, I consider myself an overeater. And many, many, many times that I overeat are linked to stressful event, to either because of personal emotion that are stressing me or either because of work that is stressing me. And one of the association through a lot of self-work, like I know this about myself because I have worked through my own journey and did what we call self-work. But I know for me, it's because of emotion I don't want to feel.
Yeah, exactly. And we talk about, there are phrases like, what are you really hungry for?
Yes.
And if you're hungry for attention or hungry for reassurance or hungry for someone just to give you a hug during a bad time. Food isn't going to replace that. It does actually lower cortisol levels, but only for a brief period of time. So it's not a good fix.
Yeah, because when you eat, it does release dopamine in your brain. So you have the happy-go-lucky neurotransmitter in your brain that makes you feel good, but it's not sustainable. It's a short period release of that dopamine in your brain. So I know for me it's emotion, but is there other reason than emotion that leads to overeating or binging or compulsive eating?
Happiness.
Lack thereof?
Well, no.
No?
It's not always negative emotions that cause overeating. You would think about Christmas or family dinners
True.
or family get togethers. People overeat to celebrate. They overeat when they're sad. They overeat when they're anxious. Any kind of emotion doesn't have to be a negative emotion can trigger overeating. And I think what you said is the most important thing. It's you don't want to feel it or it feels too much. Even the happiness can feel like, oh my God, I'm out of control. I'm losing control with my happiness, which seems odd. But if you've been raised in a family not to know how to deal with your emotions, or you're just that kind of person who's uncomfortable with emotions, then that feeling of overwhelming happiness can be a problem too.
Very good point. Is there medical condition in the body, like physical condition that can cause overeating, binge eating, or compulsive eating, or it's strictly emotional based?
Yeah, I don't think anything is strictly emotionally based. There's a lot of research now that is showing that, particularly the brain reward center, where dopamine is produced, as you mentioned, there can be changes in that based on your genetic makeup. And interestingly, those adverse childhood experiences can affect your dopamine production. So people who've had those can have decrease in dopamine receptors, so they are not getting the bang from their dopamine that someone who doesn't have that. Other things that we usually don't talk about on podcasts, but I'll just mention briefly, is attachment disorders,
Okay.
which a Canadian doctor has talked a lot about in relationship to substance use disorder. And that has to do with if, for whatever reason, you were unable to bond with your caretaker, whether it was your mother or grandmother, whoever took care of you from baby on, if you weren't able to form that bond, maybe your mother was severely depressed, so she wasn't available to bond with you, or maybe one of your parents was in jail, or maybe they were very chaotic and disturbed themselves. So there's lots of reasons why babies don't bond, but when you don't bond, it changes the way your brain is wired. So again, it puts you at higher risk for substance use disorders, other impulsive and compulsive disorders, including ADD and depression, anxiety, overeating, etc.
Would that doctor be Gabriel Mathey?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So for people listening,
Gabor is his first name, Gabor Mate.
Gabor Maté.
Yeah, and he has a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghost, which is an incredible read. And I interviewed him on my radio show when I had it several years ago. He's now become very famous in America, but I just want to say that I was the one who discovered him, just FYI.
I'm a huge fan of Gabor Mathey. So for people, I'll link to the book in the show note. It's a profound way of looking at addiction in general, that it is food, alcohol, drug. It's profoundly different of what you're seeing from mass media out. So if you are interested in another perspective, just like I offer you a different perspective on dieting, if you're interested in a different perspective, anything surrounding addiction, I would highly recommend you Google him at least, or go check out his book.
And I can say that on my website, I have a link to the radio interview that I did with him.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, so it's www.carolynrossmd.com. And under the radio shows, there's a link to, which was, I found to be one of the most fascinating people that I've ever interviewed. And there were, a number. So I think what he brings to the table is really different than what we talk about in America or in mass media. And that is, he's saying that this attachment issue, this inability to really bond to your parents, or to your caretaker is really the start of the problem. And it actually starts when you're an infant. And then there are other things that we know about that affect the brain, such as things that happen before you're born. So, if your mother is drinking or using drugs before you were born, if there's other conditions in the mother, and even some dietary issues can affect the development of the infant's brain. So when we look at it, we're looking at things like impulse control, and that's a part of the brain that can be affected, and also the brain reward center. And if someone has binge eating disorder or compulsive overeating, it's postulated that perhaps they're not getting the same reward from eating that someone who has, quote unquote, a normal brain is getting. So they may be overeating because they're not feeling the shutoff that they should, either the satiety shutoff or the reward where you feel, that was good, that's enough.
And I would say to you, so I'm going to talk about, so for people that are on the Going to Beyond the Food project, you will have an interview with me on day 1 that I did with Sean Croxon. He did a very personal interview with me to go through my life story, but I'll share something here with Carolyn because I feel very comfortable with her and for the listener as well. So one of the things in my past is in my late teens and early 20s, there was a lot of abuse of alcohol and drugs. Mm-hmm. And it's funny enough you should say that because when I was drinking, I wouldn't go to the blackout state, but I would overdrink everybody around me. To get to the same feeling point as everyone else, I would have to drink more.
Binge drinking.
Yes, absolutely. And the same thing went with drugs. That was the same thing. I would have to use more than everyone around me.
Right. Yeah.
And now the same thing with food, right? When I eat, I can overeat. So it's very interesting. So it's not only one facet of your life, it affects everything.
And, people do that with relationships and sex and gambling and so on. What you're describing is what the researcher Kenneth Blum called brain reward deficiency syndrome. So reward deficiency syndrome, or RDS, puts you at high risk for these impulse or compulsive disorders, which include substance use, food, weight, ADD, etc. So you describe someone with brain reward deficiency syndrome. That's you. And it showed up in your food. It showed up in alcohol. It showed up in drugs. It probably has shown up in other areas, maybe working.
Absolutely. Working was the same thing. Exercises was the same thing. And I see a lot of that through the people that I work with also. They tend to be over-exerciser.
Yeah.
So in that brain reward center deficiency, what is it, like a chemical-based neurotransmitter that we need to address, or is it a repatterning of our own belief and behavior? Like, is it psycho-emotional or physical?
It starts out as a genetic issue related to the dopamine gene, the DRD2 gene. We now can test for that gene, and there are certain tests that will show you if you have that gene. And if you have that gene, you are more likely to struggle with just the things you talked about in your story of yourself, of your own story. And so it starts with the gene, and then from there it can be exacerbated by, your environment, your social interactions, attachment issues, etc. But it is a physical issue. And really, you cannot change your genes. What you can do is work with your genes.
Yes.
And what most people don't realize is that if you have that genetic risk and you find yourself with a story like the one that you have, you have to kind of get woke to the fact that you're a little different than somebody else. And that's a part that's, I think, the hardest thing for any of us to accept is that, like I'd like to be 5'10". I've said this before. I think I could have been a world famous model if I had just been taller. I'm joking. But seriously, we all have genetic issues. Like I mentioned, my higher risk for heart disease, which is of concern. But so you have to first accept what is. And what is you have certain genes, whatever those are. And then from there, you can work with your genes by, for example, doing the kind of deeper work that you've done to deal with emotional issues and so on. Even in Kenneth Blum's work, he's even shown that the 12 steps, for example, can help the brain reward center. So there's lots of ways to get that brain reward center back online. And there's also the acceptance that maybe in your life, you're not going for those high highs. Maybe it's more adjusting to where you are and how you feel right now.
I would agree with everything you said because that's been my journey in the last 6 years of awareness. So it
Mm-hmm.
starts with awareness and understanding and then accepting. And I want to layer in something that's called epigenetic, right? We know, so I know, and I've done the 23andMe testing. So I bet you if I was to give it to you, you would
Yeah,
find the gene somewhere on there. But I also believe, and we know by science now, that our gene are not the end of the story, like you said.
that's right.
It's the
And
environment.
that's right. And I think it's really, really important to say to people that's not the end of the story. And even if you go farther into the behaviors or your quote unquote diagnosis, which I'm a medical doctor, but I don't really hold to some people like having a diagnosis, so that's fine. But I think in the bigger scheme of things, they're not as relevant as what the diagnosis means for you. So I told you about my 5 steps to recovery
Yes.
that in my 30 years of working with people with all kinds of addictions, alcoholism, opiate addiction, which I see a lot of now, as well as problems with overeating and binge eating, it just occurred to me that people go through these 5 different stages. So the first stage, which is the most superficial, but which gets the most attention, is what I call the superficial level of behaviors. So people in that arena need to, everybody's looking at what they're doing. You're drinking too much, or you're, too fat, or you're binging, or whatever. And that's what gets all the attention. But it's like an iceberg. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And beneath that, then you have the emotions that are driving those behaviors. So you get angry, then you overeat. You get too happy, then you overeat or you binge, etc. So if you don't address how you handle emotions, you can never really fully recover. So you have to start at that superficial level, then go down to the emotional level. And then the third level seems really simple. It's your body sensations. Well, why do we want to know what our body's doing? From my point of view, most people with these disorders are kind of cut off at the neck. They don't want to know about their bodies. They don't want to feel their bodies. They don't want to be in their bodies. But the body is where all the healing really occurs. You hold trauma in your body. All the trauma experts say that. You hold emotions in your body. When you get angry, your shoulder gets tight or your jaw, the back of your neck or whatever. And so if you don't identify body sensations, you cannot start that conversation with your body where your body shares its wisdom. Your body is a reservoir of all the wisdom you need in order to heal. So just think about how when you overeat, your body gives you feedback. Your body's not saying you're a bad person. It's saying, I'm uncomfortable, or this doesn't work for me. And then we lay on all the judgment and so on. So that's the third level, working with the body and learning to have a relationship with your body. Then the fourth level.
Before you go there, I just want to take a breather here and share with everyone because that's a lot for many people already, right? Superficial, emotional, and then your body. The body story that Dr. Ross is saying here is so true. So for me, I was all head. And I still remember after coming out of the hospital and ended up working with a health coach, he sent me to a practitioner who was doing a form of massage called fascial stretch therapy. And I remember laying on that table and she would work something in my leg and she would say, do you feel this? I'm like, no. Do you feel this? Like literally everything she was doing in my body at a subtle level, like she wasn't punching me, she was working softly. I could not feel anything.
Interesting.
Like literally anything below my head. And I would close my eyes and she would have me try to put my mind, let's say, in my hip And I
Yeah.
could not do it. I could not feel my hip when my eyes were closed.
Yeah. That's a great representation of what I'm talking about. And I don't think most people realize it when they are in their heads, but it's pretty common in Western society that we live in our heads because we're always on the computers and thinking and listening to our thoughts. But that is not where the healing happens, it's in the body. So I've had the same experience when I worked at Sierra Tucson with people with anorexia who finally got a massage or acupuncture or did yoga. And one of the women said, it completely changed how I felt about my body when I could connect with my body instead of being separate from it.
And that's a big concept for people because every practitioner will talk about that, how we need to connect with our body. And for most people, they're like, what do you mean?
Yeah, they don't even know what it is.
So
Yeah.
that's what we mean today when we say connect with your body. And that can be done through yoga, you said acupuncture,
Any
massage.
body centered therapy, somatic experiencing, all of that. I want to give you another example,
Yeah.
though, so people can get a better idea of the body situation. I once had a patient I was trying to work with on this issue, and I said to her, because this is the other thing the body helps with, it's with emotional regulation. She was saying, I'm so angry at my mother, and this happened, and that happened, and then this happened. And I said, okay, I understand. Now, tell me, how does that anger feel in your body? Where are you feeling that anger? Well, I just feel pissed at her and she's just the worst mother in the world. And all of those things, again, are from the head. And I said, so where is that anger in the body? And 20 minutes later, it was impossible for her to really experience that anger in the body. And it was like a process that we went through on a regular basis until she could say, when I get angry, I feel nauseous. I feel hot all over. I feel tension in my arms or my neck, etc. But again, that's what the body is there for, is to help you identify and process your emotions as well as to give you feedback about food and about people. Think about, meeting someone for the first time and you walk up to them and you may not even be aware of it, but you have a feeling about them. Either the hair on the back of your neck stands up, or you feel threatened in some way, or you feel drawn to them. That's all body stuff. So that's just an example of how important those body sensations are.
So an assumption then will go because we aren't connecting with our body, we aren't feeling our emotion, and the binge comes because of that.
We're not regulating our emotions because we're not aware, because we don't feel them. We only think them. And so then we think, oh, I'm mad and I feel uncomfortable, but I'm not noticing where the discomfort is. It's just a general feeling of I'm uncomfortable. And so I have to do something right now.
And then I eat.
And then I eat, or then I drink, or fill in the blank.
That's pretty powerful because in most common explanation of binge eating or overeating or compulsive eating, we don't explain it that way.
Yeah, it's been the central philosophy of my work for many, many decades now. And I have really been very blessed to realize that early in my career, because I think it's helped me to understand what people are going through and why this is happening. So now I have to say there are other people who have, lots of other explanations. It's a brain disease. We have to
Yes.
use this medication, give them a prescription. I do that too, if it's appropriate. But I also always try to do the deeper work because that's what sustains people over the long run.
That deeper work that it is on the scale of binge eating, that is just compulsive eating, overeating, or binge eating, the solution to any of this is the work we're just talking about here.
It's not about food.
Okay.
It's beyond the food. As you so aptly have said many times, it's beyond the food.
So let's recap. External behavior.
Yeah, so the superficial layer is where the behavior is. That's the tip of the iceberg that you see.
Okay.
That's above the water. Beneath the water are the emotions that drive the behaviors. So I feel, therefore I eat, right? And then under that is the hidden sensations of the body and that lack, that separation from the body, you know? I mean, in the Bible, I'm not super religious, but I remember this from Bible school, that separation from God is the true sin. I think it's the same separation from your body. It's almost impossible, I think, to be truly happy in your life unless you are in your body.
Step number 4.
But number 4 is the core, the core belief. We could get really deep here.
I know, we could.
Level number 4 are the core beliefs. So here's what happens. You're a child. Something happens to you, whether you grow up in a family where you're criticized about your weight or you're told that you're fat or you're bullied at school, whatever happens. Maybe you have some attachment issues. Maybe you have that DRD2 gene that we talked about. And then throughout your life, you start to make assumptions about yourself based on what other people are telling you and what you're feeling. So I'll give you a really great example. This was a patient I had who was a binge eater, and he was married to a woman who's very wealthy, and he was not wealthy. He worked for the family business, and he kept dieting and dieting and dieting. He would lose weight, and what he couldn't understand is then he would regain all the weight. When we went through this and looked at his childhood, he said he had been very asthmatic as a child. So he was sickly. And then he had an older brother who would tease him because when they'd get into trouble, the mom would punish the older brother. But she would say to the sickly one, my patient, oh, just go to your room and close the door. And then the brother would come in and he would pound his younger brother. So to make a long story short, one day when my patient was like 18 or 19, when his brother came in to pound him, he got so angry, he ripped the door off his brother's bedroom. And unbeknownst to him, in that instant, he formed a belief bigger is better. Because as a bigger person, he was able to defend himself against his brother. So whenever he would lose weight in his marriage or in his work, he would feel too vulnerable. And when he would feel too vulnerable, what would he want to do? He would want to eat, and then he would gain the weight back. And so that's why he was stuck in that cycle, because that core belief, bigger is better, was underneath driving, and he wasn't even conscious of it. He had completely forgotten about it until we did this process. So everybody has lots of core beliefs. So one of my patients will say, my core belief is I'm worthless, or I don't deserve anything, or I am weak. And these come from a variety of experiences. And it's so amazing to me how many of these experiences stick with us throughout our lives into our 60s and 70s. And we keep asking ourselves, why am I keep doing this? I know it's not good for me. It's because there's that hidden belief that's driving the car to the fast food restaurant, even though you don't know who's in the driver's seat. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. How do we identify our core belief and how do we alter them, I guess? Can we change a core belief?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I don't want to sound like an advertisement, but I'm going to just tell you it's a process. And in each of the books I've written, I actually take people through the process. So you start with, just like I said to you about the case, I started with him saying, what's the earliest time you remember feeling this way? And then there may be other questions along the way. So in each of the books I've written, because they're workbooks, I've taken people through that process so they can do it for themselves. And then they can uncover their core belief. And once you uncover the core belief, like for him, bigger is better, then you have to ask yourself, is this something that still fits for me? Because most of the time, these core beliefs come from an earlier time in your life. And the interesting thing is we just accept them. We're adults, but we're still thinking bigger is better. It's just that child part of ourselves, like, how they talk about inner child. So that's your inner child just speaking up saying, I'm still uncomfortable in here. So you have to then ask yourself, is the child correct? Is bigger better? It was correct for the child, for sure. It was correct. But what about for you? And most of the time, the answer is no. I am the adult now. So I can manage these situations in a different way. And then you have to learn the skills to do that.
Awesome. So for the people listening right now, if you go to the show notes, so stephaniedozzi.com/099, you will get the link to Dr. Ross's website, and all their books are there. And I know you do have a free tool also online to help with that. There's a meditation also available.
Yeah, there's a free meditation you can download. The books obviously do show you my processes, and feel free to use those. And then I also work with people both individually and in groups in this same way. So all of that information is available on my website. So I don't want to waste time and not get to what I consider my favorite level, which
Number
is
5.
Number 5. I know people are probably swimming thinking, oh my God, this is too much for me to deal with. But, just remember, it's a process. You have to go through one after another, and sometimes back to 1 and then to 3 and then da-da-da. So it's not all in one day. But the 5th level is the level of soul satisfaction. So how I conceptualize this is that in the beginning, it's your behaviors, your emotions, and all of that we've talked about that drive what you do. And when you really are truly in recovery and have done this deeper work, you begin to realize that you're here for one reason, and that is to love yourself and to satisfy your soul. When I say soul, it doesn't have to be spiritual. It could be your spirit, your sense of who you are, your authentic self. So for me, at this stage in my life, as I get older, I realize more and more how important it is to meet my authentic self. I've met different parts of her throughout my life. As a mother, I can say I felt the most authentic I've ever been. As a grandmother, there are parts of you that are authentic, but I think when you really meet your authentic self, that's what the meaning of self-love is. And I hate using the word just because so many people say, love yourself, love your body. It just drives me crazy. And it's not something you can just wave a magic wand and suddenly you love yourself. No, it is the joy and the work of a lifetime. But soul satisfaction. So I do a meditation that you don't even have to meditate. Just ask yourself, if you were to be satisfying your soul right now in your life, how would that look? What would you do differently? And most people can connect with that question. And it could be something simple like, I'd spend more time in nature. I'd spend more time with my children. I would do this. I would finally leave my horrible job. But it may be something small, like I'd tell my husband I love him.
One of the speaker on the conference, Leanne Vogel, she shared her story. I did a track of case study, and for her, satisfying her soul was to color her hair purple.
Yeah.
She's been wanting to do that, but she was afraid of judgment. At some point, she said, screw it. I'm just doing it.
I have that one too. I always say I want to color my hair pink or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
But, I'm a doctor. Doctors can't have pink hair. That's a given, right?
Yeah.
That's my belief. Yeah, it's anything small or whatever expresses who you truly are. And I think we all know who we are inside, but we don't always pay attention to that. And once you start paying attention, then that's what drives your life. That's what drives your behaviors. That's how you regulate your emotions. That's how you change your core beliefs.
It's through finding your life, what some people may say your life purpose, your soul satisfaction, and then turning that around and live your life from that place.
I don't want to say life purpose because that sounds really big and heavy. This is really tiny and small. It's just meeting yourself for the first time, honoring your spirit, nourishing your spirit, those kinds of things. So I say satisfy your soul, not the scale, when it comes down to this stuff that we're talking about. We're always working on satisfying other people or trying to get to a certain number, but we should be working on satisfying our souls.
So these are the 5 layers of healing that
Mm-hmm.
must happen to help ourselves with compulsive eating, binging, and overeating. And I asked this morning, for those who follow me on Instagram in preparation for this interview, I asked people to send me questions that they had for you.
Yeah.
We're not going to have time to go through all of them, but there is one that keeps coming back all the time. And this woman say, I do binge eat, but I love it. I love binge eating. What can I do?
Yeah. Well, I would challenge that statement because I hear that a lot. I hear people say, even with overeating, well, I just love to eat. I just love food. And so I'll challenge that person who wrote in the question to write a page about your favorite binge foods and describe them in great detail. And when most of my patients have done that, they realize that it's not the food they love, it's the feeling that the food gives them. Most of them don't even notice the taste of the food. Like I can tell you what I love to eat, and I could write a page about it because it's creamy, it's salty, it's sweet, it has a certain flavor and so on and so forth. But for the people who say they love to binge, just describe your favorite binge food in great detail and then look at the writing and see if it's all about the feeling that you get instead of about the food. It's the feeling. So you're binging because you want to feel calm or numb or fill in the blank, whatever it is for you.
You're seeking the emotion that the food give you, but superficially in your mind, you think it's the food you want, when in fact it is the emotion that the food gives you.
Correct.
That's
Yeah.
brilliant.
And then I would just say that there are many other ways to get that same feeling besides binging. So if you truly want to stop, first of all, you have to be willing. So if you truly want to stop, then write that out and ask yourself, what does that say about the binge and why do you really like it?
That's very brilliant answer. Then the other one I want to tackle, because I know that's a lot of people again listening, is the whole restriction mindset. So people, and I can think of one lady that we did a broadcast with a couple of days ago. For her, she was a competitive fitness professional. So she, competitive figure, they had to diet up, diet down, diet up, diet down. And she's out of that because she nearly died of the whole process. But now she's trapped in this whole restriction, calorie counting, binging, restricting, binging, and she doesn't know how to get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very difficult. And I think you have to start with providing yourself some structure. And the structure may feel difficult at first, but you have to allow your best friend, which is your body, to reset itself. So that's why, in that kind of case, I would suggest that they go and see a great dietitian, sit down and develop a way of eating where they can eat every day and not restrict, and practice that so that their bodies can reset. And then once the body resets, then you can use what many people call intuitive eating to help you stay on track. But there's probably, again, more to what she's talking about than just the restricting. It's the why behind the restricting and the fears that are related to eating normally. And that's what's going to have to be dealt with, because someone who's been a competitive athlete, they have a lot of fear of failure, fear of losing, fear of people's disappointment in them, and so on and so forth. So you can't just change what you eat without dealing with the emotions associated with that restricting and binging.
And this is a perfect segue to the end of the show, because many people will look at this situation of professional fitness and say, well, we just got to deal with the food component. Where in fact, I want to challenge, just like Dr. Carolyn says, what drove you to go in that behavior of fitness competition in the first place?
Absolutely. You go all the way back to that. And a lot of it is, my parents expected me to do this, or I wanted to be popular, or, there are all sorts of reasons. So the deeper you can go, the more long lasting your recovery will be.
Exactly. So it's about going beyond the simple food or the restriction, is understanding what led to this. It's a bunch of, as we said, it's a bunch of layers that we need to understand.
It's a deep dive.
Yeah, the deep five, exactly. So thank you so much for sharing yet again your time with us today, because this was a big topic that a lot of women wanted to talk about. And your approach in it is in such a way that it goes to the root instead of just brushing at the surface of it. And that's why I admire about your work. And I'm so grateful that you were here with us today.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Stephanie, and it's an opportunity to talk to your people.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I want to remind everyone, you can go to the show notes, stephaniedozzi.com/099, and get all the link of all the books we talked about and the website for you to continue with Dr. Russ. Thank you.
Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm so glad you stuck around till the end. And if you did learn something today, or if you are interested in learning more, and if you want to influence a loved one in your life, you got to share this message, because this is not a message that you will find on the cover of the Time magazine or the evening news. This is underground wellness, underground healing. And we need people like you listening today to share the message at a grassroots level so we can get the word out that we can heal binge eating and overeating. We're not stuck with it, and we do not need to restrict more. So if you did enjoy the show, you learned something, please share with people around you. Help us get the word out to the world. Register for the Going Beyond the Food project in the show note or on the website goingbeyondthefoodproject.com. And I will see you on the project that, if you're listening in time right now, it is starting November 1st, 2017. So we're only a few days away from it. And to celebrate that, the 100th episode of the Going Beyond the Food show will be next Thursday. So to celebrate that, we're actually going to do a live Q&A. I'm going to take you behind the scene of the Going Beyond the Food project, and we're going to record live the podcast episode during one of the wrap-up session of the online summit. So from November 1st to the 7th, every day we're going to broadcast for free the interview with the expert. And every night at 9 p.m., I'm going to do a live broadcast on Facebook. It's called a wrap-up session, where I'm going to answer your question, discuss with you. We're just going to have a good conversation. So I'm going to record the next podcast during the wrap-up session of the Thursday, November 1st. If you want to come live and ask me a question, you got to come into my Facebook page. So the link will be in the show notes, stephaniedozzi.com/099. You can join the event and be live with me in the recording of the 100th episode of this podcast. It has been an absolute ride of pleasure being with you. It's a year now that this podcast is going. So I'm so happy to be able to do this event with you on November 1st. If you're listening to that post November 1st, then you can go to the recording and you can listen to the Q&A that was recorded on November 1st, 2017. I'm glad that you were able to be with me and Dr. Ross today. I love you, and I will see you on episode 100.